I've talked about the data, I've given you a short history lesson, and now I want to talk a little bit about interventions. And to kind of set up this conversation about interventions, I do need to introduce a little more information. And the information I need to discuss briefly has to do with jobs. This is a table that looks at the percent of all of the jobs in the region that is captured by each locality. Richmond's share of regional jobs is just getting smaller and smaller. The largest single employer now is Henrico, no longer the city of Richmond. Between 1900 and 2010, the region itself did quite well. It gained over 82,000 jobs. But during that same time, when the region gained 82,000, the city lost 40,000. That is enormous, the difference between a gain of 82 and the loss of 40. And then between 2000 and 2010, the region gained 4,800 and the city lost over 18,000 jobs. The city has lost all kinds of jobs. They lost high-wage jobs, middle-wage jobs, and actually the middle-wage jobs registers the sharpest decline, particularly between 1990 and 2000. Low-wage jobs has just been on a steady decline over the years. There is a huge labor force that is desperate for employment, concentrated in the poor neighborhoods of Richmond. You need a car. And so the census actually counts cars, not just people, but cars. And I was curious how Richmond stacks up in terms of households, not individuals, but households without a car. And it's quite alarming that 19% of all of the households in Richmond, households, mind you, not families, don't own a car. Then when you add households that have only one car, and that can be problematic for large households trying to negotiate getting to work, getting to school, getting to the grocery store with just one car, it's very difficult. At any rate, when you add households with one car to those who have no car, then the percent zooms upward to 61%. It is astounding. So we can't expect the automobile to close that gap between the labor force and job availability. Public transit is absolutely essential. What you have in this map, the dark purple right here, you see the dark purple lines, a little hard to make out. These are the actual bus lines. The lighter purple, which is kind of shaded over areas, this represents walking distance to the bus so that people can easily walk within this lighter purple area to catch a bus. Now, the kind of turquoise circles represent numbers of employees and are employers with a large labor force. The larger the circle, the larger number of jobs. This map is very self-explanatory. All one has to do is to look at these circles that are beyond the reach of these bus lines. Way out here in Henrico County and increasingly pretty soon Goochland, Chesterfield County, even beyond Chesterfield, up here in the north, in the northeast quadrant, that these jobs are not accessible to people who don't have a car and have to rely on a bus. So there's a disconnect. And right there suggests a major intervention that we have got to press for the extension of bus lines. Bus lines that would literally form a web throughout the metropolitan area. One of the big problems, of course, is getting strong support from the counties. The other alternative is to move. But to move, there has to be housing that a low, moderate income person can afford. And there is another challenge. There is a great shortage of such housing, particularly in the suburbs. The latest report from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition notes that in the Richmond metropolitan area, for one to afford the market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, you've got to be prepared to pay a rent of $930 a month. Now, a rule of thumb is that one should not be paying more than 30% of their income for housing. And using that rule, and if you pay $930 a month for this 2-bedroom apartment, then that means you're going to have an annual salary of over $37,000, or your income annually needs to be a bit over $37,000. What many citizens don't fully understand is that a lot of state employees, as a matter of fact, 30% of all the people who work for the Commonwealth of Virginia earn less than $35,000. They can't afford the average market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. What kind of hourly wage do you need in order to afford that apartment? $17.88, and yet the average wage for renters in Richmond is $14.74. So you can clearly see the gap. And then federal minimum wage is $7.25. Only other alternative beyond extending transit so that people who need jobs have access to jobs that are much more plentiful in the newer suburbs, in addition to housing that would enable people to live closer to work. Another alternative is to drive economic development, particularly the kind of economic development that would create jobs for people with not a high level of education. Drive that economic development back into the city. But once again, we're faced with a challenge in that the city of Richmond is old, small, and landlocked. As you know, this city was founded in the 18th century, and even though we annexed over the years and acquired more land, the fact is most of our land is already developed. And the fact that we now have just a land mass of 60 square miles suggests that because most of it's developed, to accommodate development, quite commonly, it is necessary to clean up an old industrial site, to mitigate it in order to make it suitable for new development. And if one is a developer and you have a decision to make that you could go out to Hanover County and buy a greenfield, start construction almost immediately, or you could come into the city of Richmond and spend more money cleaning up a brownfield, that most commonly developers will choose the former. The other problem that the city faces, in addition to being old and with land that is pretty much developed, is that beginning in the late 1970s, due to changes in state annexation law, the city no longer can expand its boundaries. It is landlocked. And yet this is a reality that the city has to live with in terms of getting economic development back into the city. This is the last slide, and one of the most interesting slides of them all. This slide was prepared by Will Sanford, who at the time was a research analyst with Housing Opportunities Made Equal. And what he did was to map out areas of opportunity. Opportunity is defined as places where you have a high home ownership rate, where the poverty rate is low. As a matter of fact, there are several different indicators that you can see there on the left side of the table. Naturally, low opportunity would be where the poverty rates are high, where there's a large percent of the population receiving public assistance, and again, you could see those under their other indicators. He assumes that if you were to get in a car, drive east from Short Pump out to Sandston, that as you make your way from Short Pump to Sandston, that as this little graph notes, you are going from an area of high opportunity steadily downward. When you hit the city, it gets very low, and then it literally bottoms out at Gilpin Court. It goes up a bit, and then once again it bottoms out at Whitcomb Court. And then opportunity begins to go up again until you reach Sandston. It's a powerful visual of where there is opportunity and where there is not opportunity. There is a theory that's often used, known as the theory of public choice. And public choice theory can explain in large measure why business locates where it does and why people locate where they do. The idea is that businesses and people will seek out locations where they are getting the best services for the case. In the case of people, often that's schools, where they can get the best schools for the lowest cost. That would be where the property taxes are lowest. Similarly, businesses would locate in areas where they would get the kinds of utilities that they need, again, in areas where the taxes would be low. And when you have a metropolitan area comprised of several jurisdictions, each of these jurisdictions are competing with each other for business and economic development and also for population. And therefore, the localities that are doing the best are those localities that are growing economically. And in all likelihood, those are going to be areas where services are good, where you've got good schools, and where the property taxes are low. That does help explain, for example, why people move where they do here in the Richmond metropolitan area and why businesses locate where they do. The one flaw in this theory is that it makes an assumption. And the assumption is mobility, that people do move. But there's a whole group of people that are immobile. They're stuck. They can't move. And they are called the poor. They would like better schools. They would like neighborhoods that are safe. They would like good jobs that pay a living wage. They would like the very things that all of the rest of us have. Their problem is they don't have that choice. They can't move. If they do move, they move from one poor neighborhood, usually to another poor neighborhood. A lot of people even define poverty as a population that is immobile and lacks choice, and that their immobility puts them in areas of no opportunity.